Who doesn't want to work on the best team ever? But what does it take to put together a team and cultivate the environment where everyone truly gets to be their best self and do their best work? Well, it might be simpler than you think. Today's guest is David Burkus. One of the leading business thinkers, David's forward-thinking ideas and best-selling books are changing how companies approach leadership, teamwork, and collaboration. A skilled and inspiring communicator, David is the best-selling author of 5 books about business and leadership. His books have won multiple awards and have been translated into dozens of languages. Since 2017, David has been ranked multiple times as one of the world's top business thought leaders. Now, before I dive in, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I share new episodes and tips for managers every week. Now here's my conversation with David. Thank you so much for joining me today, David. I'm super psyched to talk about the findings and the models that you have designed and elicited from your research and your work on best team ever. I also just love that idea, and I want to have a banner that I can just give to random teams. Where I'm like, you are the best team ever. It's just I don't know why I love that phrase, and I'm just really excited to have you here.
Oh, well, thank you. My only complaint in titling a book and a model called Best Team Ever is that despite getting all of the registration and copyrights and all that sort of stuff, the legal things, trademarks and whatever, it's only really for the book. And so there are those banners and cards and mugs and t-shirts all over Amazon. And every time I type my own book title into Amazon, guess what comes up? Not my book. All of those banners and and what have you. So they definitely already exist. I can point you to a few of them that I bought for myself.
Awesome. Well, I did not have any trouble finding your book because I always put the word book at the end of any title. I don't know why I do that because Amazon clearly knows if I'm looking for a book. It's all I buy off Amazon. But regardless, good to know because now I'm going to go get myself a little best team ever mug or something.
Yeah. Love it. Love it.
Why don't you give us the whole, what is best team ever? Why did you choose that name? And just give us the highlights.
This is the 5th book I've written. And it's really funny because in the early days of writing, you try and write a title that's clever, right? You try and write something that's intriguing and what have you. So the first book is the myths of creativity. Ooh, what are those myths? That's so intriguing, right? And then we got clever with a book called Under New Management for new managers. Oh, that's clever because I see the signs outside, whatever. And eventually it was you know what probably works better is just what's the promise that we're offering in the book? Maybe people just search for that. What do leaders want? Well, they want to lead the best team ever. Okay, well, let's just make it that then. I wish I had a better story for how we came up with it, but it was that. It was literally maybe we should stop being so clever and start just offering what is it, right? Fundamentally, the thesis of the book is that when you talk to a lot of people about how you improve the performance on a team, how you turn a team into the best team ever, they have all sorts of different reasons, and they usually ignore the most important one. They might talk about recruiting new talent. We need to get the right people on the bus, to use the Jim Collins phrase, or we need to increase our performance incentives, or all that sort of stuff. And those are all attempts to drive individual performance through talent and what have you. And what we find when you look at the research is that those things work, but they don't work nearly as effectively as paying attention to the culture of the team. And when I say culture here, I don't mean it's casual Friday or we bring our dogs to work or whatever. I'm talking about the habits, the norms of behavior, the ways they interact, just the norms of that team. Right. And as we say in the book, this sort of main thesis is that actually, when you look at teams, talent doesn't make the team makes the talent. You shape the culture of the team and you create an environment that can kind of unlock individual talent and turn it into performance. Talent is great. All things being equal, I want talented people, but all things are not equal. And I can't always control the talent that I have. What I can do as a leader is to shape the culture of that team. And then specifically, we find in the book, we outline kind of the 3 fundamental elements of that culture. So now that we know those norms and behaviors, what do they look like? What are they? What does the research say on them? And most importantly, what could you do? Right? As a modern manager, what can you do to start driving the culture in each of those 3 areas?
I want to go back to this thing you said about talent doesn't make
the team makes the talent.
Can you give us an example of what you mean by that, or share a story that kind of illustrates what's the difference that you're driving towards?
I hate doing this because I'm a guy and I realize I'm going to write off half the audience here when I say this, but the most ever present examples are in things like sports, right? Where you get a really talented new recruit, they can add something incredible to the team, and yet kind of everything falls apart. Man, I know this pain personally because I'm a Philadelphia Eagles fan, right? And I don't know if you watched last season, we've had off to a great start, really new talented people, And then because of divisions between the offensive coordinators and other things, because the culture of the team broke down, they just had a horrible end run of the season. And that's kind of what I mean. I know it's a sort of broad, very famous and whatever analogy. And I know half the group probably just rolled their eyes because they're not, maybe not sports fans, et cetera. And actually in the book, this is really funny. This is a side. In the book, I make a point to only talk about two sports in the entire book: curling and women's gymnastics, just because I feel like if I'm going to talk about sports, it should be sports you've never heard about. Anyway, I digress. We've all seen that kind of happen, and we've probably seen the exact same thing. We've seen it in a work context. If you have a career longer than say 10 or 15 years, you probably had the experience of being really excited to join a new team, whether that's a whole new company, whether that's a new project team, whether that's a new initiative or what have you. And then as you get in, you start to realize, wait a minute, I just really can't feel like I can make a contribution here because there's so much infighting, there's so much bickering, there's so much whatever, right? And if we change those things, what we find is we can create an environment where people feel like they actually can bring their whole selves to work, actually can contribute their talents, and we can turn that team around. Assuming that you're doing a decent job hiring as a manager, most of the performance problems you're probably getting from your people are not actually individual characteristics like a lack of knowledge or a lack of motivation. They are predominantly either a teams or a systems issue. The team culture is not helping them be themselves, or they don't have access to a resource they need or something like that. Maybe there'll be a book down the road about the system side, but for now, what every leader at every level can focus on is that culture of the team.
I appreciate you limiting the sports. But also, it really is a great example. And we've also seen, I think, the opposite, like tons of movies talk about like the ragtag group of people who are put together and suddenly become this amazing, successful team. And that happens because of the culture and the teamwork and the way that they're able to collaborate that brings out the best of each person. So I think it is a good example. Okay. Can you explain the model now? Because you said there's 3 different components. So what are those pieces that we potentially have actually some leverage and control over?
When you look at the research, both like what we would call in the lab research and also long field studies over a long period of time of actual companies, you find that while this is not an exhaustive list, there's probably other attributes of each individual team. The places where these teams almost always overlap is they have all 3 characteristics in place. They're marked by a sense of what I call in the book common understanding, a sense of psychological safety, and a sense of pro-social purpose. A common understanding is kind of how well people understand their roles and responsibilities, their expectations, their knowledge, skills, and abilities, both of themselves and of other people on the team. So I often call that clarity. But it's also how well they have empathy for the other people on the team, how well they understand the differences of the other team, that some people have different work preferences. Some people have different sets of knowledge, skills, and abilities. Some people are introverts. Some people are extroverts. Some people work great in an office. Some people work great at home. Some people love sports analogies. Some people already roll their eyes, right? Everybody's different and nobody's right. The only thing that's right is to develop an understanding of how other people tick so that you can collaborate best with them, right? And so we lump those together, call it clarity and empathy, and we call it this sense of common understanding. Psychological safety, this is probably not a term if you've been a manager for longer than a year or two. Somebody probably already sent you a training or something like that on psych safety, because thankfully, after 40 years of Amy Edmondson and others really pushing this in the research, we're talking about it. But it's this sense of how well people feel safe to express themselves and to take interpersonal risks, how well they feel like they can speak up when they disagree or talk about a failure and lessons learned, right? And what you find is that not only does raising this sense of psychological safety lead to people feeling more included and belonging in the workplace, the team as a whole taps into more of a growth mindset because they find that they can learn from each other's failures and have a conversation about it because people are open and honest and not trying to hide it. And then that last element is a sense of pro-social purpose. And I put the modifier pro-social on this specifically because what we find is that purpose matters. There's no new research there. You want your team to understand why they do what they do, right? But what we found in about the last 10 years is that often the strongest answer to a why is by being able to point to a who. And this is the huge opportunity as a manager, is that you can point to who is served by our team doing their work. Not everyone, especially in a large organization, not everyone gets to see the end product, the end user, the end customer, stakeholder, what have you. So as a manager, one of the things that's incumbent upon you to do is talk about how the role your team does serves that larger purpose, even if it's just your who is passing it off to the next person, or the role that you play sort of with, let's call it an internal customer. right? And when you see that you switch and you answer that question why with the who, you not only see the same level of intrinsic motivation you get from speaking purpose in any way, but when you make it about people, you also see increases in teamwork and helping and what we nerdy org psych people call organizational citizenship behaviors. Basically, you see an increase in people who go beyond their job description in order to help out the whole team. And so you see, again, you click better on a cultural collaboration level when you're tied into that purpose, not just the individual motivation side. And both of those things drive performance tremendously.
I love this model. And all three of those things seem like so obvious in some ways, and also like a little bit of like light bulbs going off around the nuances that you're pulling out here. I'm wondering if you have a story or a client that you can kind of talk about, like what was that transformational process look like? And like, how do you kind of start from understanding where you're at and then implementing something, strategies and approaches to start to shift?
As you could probably tell too, they all sort of interact with each other, right? It's hard to, without the empathy side of common understanding, it's hard to build psychological safety and what have you. And I think probably my favorite example, we talk about in the book, is my favorite because he's just an amazing human and one of my favorite, probably my choice for greatest living CEO. Maybe I'll qualify with living. But in the book, we tell the story of Alan Mulally and the turnaround at Ford Motor Company. And it is 100% a cultural transformation before it was a business transformation, right? And I've been fortunate enough, I've known Alan's executive coach for a while, and he introduced us, and I got to spend tons of hours learning from him, right? Which is really, really cool. Not just writing the case study, but talking about all sorts of other stuff. So Alan was the CEO at Boeing. He was in charge of Boeing Commercial Airlines. He was in charge of the turnaround after September 11th, right? Picture on September 12th, basically every major airline in the country cancels their airplane order because they don't know what the future of flight is. And Alan's got to figure out a way to keep the company afloat. So dealt with that crisis pretty easily. And in 2006, Ford tapped him to say, hey, we have another crisis, right? We're totally tanking. Our share price is trading at $1. Our current strategic plan for the year calls for us to still lose $7 billion. Right? You think, every manager here listening, right? Like, you think you have problems. Imagine that the definition of doing your best is to still lose that much money, right? This is what he inherited. And when Alan joins the CEO spot, it's funny, the board actually tells him about certain toxic people and, hey, do you want us to fire this person ahead of time and blah, blah, blah. And Alan said, no, you don't need to do any of that. And they're like, really? Because you don't want to be the bad guy. You don't want to fire him. He goes, oh, I'm not going to fire anybody. Right? Well, it's very clear from doing all this research that we need to change how the senior leadership team operates. And some people are going to self-select out of that. And it's probably the same people you have on your list. So I don't feel the need to fire anybody. I'm just going to enforce new cultural norms. And some people are going to select, if you want to make a huge change on a team, you either have to change the people, meaning their hearts, or you have to change the people, meaning them, actually. And Alan thought he'd go with the first one, right? So he instituted a lot of different rules for behavior, how we're going to act as a team. First of all, on the clarity side, we're going to do regular updates with each other. Every Thursday morning, 7 a.m., Thunderbird Conference Room in Dearborn, Michigan, every single executive on that senior leadership team is going to meet and give a status update so that we all have clarity. We're going to do some things outside of that to get to know each other on the empathy side. But probably the most important, and the place Alan identifies needing to start, was with a sense of psychological safety. At the time, and I think it's true now today in most of the big three automakers in the United States, it was a pretty toxic culture. It was a culture where people were competing with each other for promotions. A lot of times in very large organizations, you see this really easily. People lose sight of who the real competition is, and they start thinking about the internal competition for things like promotions and bonuses and what have you. And that was true at every level inside this company. And so what do you get when you do that at a senior leadership team? You get people who are never willing to admit that they're failing in any capacity because that might limit their career prospects. You get people who are looking for an opportunity to step over somebody else when they show a vulnerability. And so you get a group of people who aren't going to give you the real story. And this is one of the biggest things that Alan emphasizes we need to be doing. Now, there are certain little habits that need to be changed in order to help turn this culture around, right? Like, he set a rule, for example, that even in their socialization, even in their retreats and what have you, the team would never make a joke at someone else's expense, which seems small, but it's actually huge if you think about it, right? Because it's not funny to that person. It might be funny to the whole rest of the group, but it's not funny to that person. And by the way, like, I kind of take issue with this one. So I grew up in Philly. I lived for a time in Boston before I moved to the South, right? So I spent the first 20 years where, like, snark is my love language, right? Like, My wife, who's from the South, will come to like family meetings and be like, why does your family hate each other? No, we don't hate each other. You're always criticizing each other. Like, oh, we're just kidding around. But still, it creates a weird tension that Alan recognized needs to dissipate. Because if you're making jokes at other people's expenses, what do they now not feel safe to do? Talk about any other vulnerabilities. And we needed people talking about where they were behind. This is a company that's going to lose $7 billion this year. We need to talk about what's wrong so we can fix it. It took time. It took actually 8 weeks of these different meetings for anyone to actually first speak up and say, hey, here's where we're struggling on something. It was one executive, a guy named Mark Fields, was behind in the launch of the Ford Edge and basically got to the point where he couldn't hide it anymore. So he had to admit it. And the moment he admitted it, everybody else on the team felt like that's it. That's the end. He's going to chew into Mark, right? And Mark's going to be dismissed. Alan actually told me when Mark basically stood up and said, we have a problem, right? And we're going to be behind on this thing. Everybody immediately looked at Alan for his response. And Alan told me he felt like everybody was waiting for him to like push a button under the desk and like trap doors would come and Mark would like drop out, or two big security guards were just going to escort him out. Like this was a culture previously where people felt like any vulnerability and you're gone. And that's not what Alan did. Instead, he started clapping. Hey, Mark, that's great transparency. Thank you. All right, team, what can we do for him? And the whole meeting turned into a conversation about how they could help Mark, right? Not punish Mark, not hurt Mark, right? Not chew out Mark, but help Mark. And Alan would tell me that moment, that experience, right? Watching how a leader responds to those setbacks in a positive way, that was the moment that saved Ford, because it led to other people being willing to talk about their own, right? And the reason I bring up this whole story, not only because there's a cultural transformation that has to happen on this team so that they can function, but there's this misconception that psychological safety is just about trust. Oh, we just need to build, let's go on a retreat and let's do a trust fall, or let's take a personality test and we'll build the sense of trust. It's not just trust. You build trust to get to the point where someone's willing to take that risk, right? Alan has to spend 2 months enforcing these different rules, like never a joke at someone else's expense, et cetera. In order to get the trust level, he has to be asking for where are we behind so often in order to build the trust level to the point where someone's willing to take the risk. And then he has to meet that risk with respect, right? He has to recognize that. And in a failure, that means you have to recognize that, okay, my role as a leader is now to help you, not to hurt you, not to punish you. It's to help you, right? But it's the same thing if somebody speaks up to disagree with you as a leader. That's another form of risk. You have to meet it with respect, right? Okay, tell me more. They have to feel heard, right? And so the reason that was the moment that saved Ford is not just that, hey, now other people are talking about their vulnerabilities. Alan's modeling the behavior of how we're actually supposed to respond to calls for help. And over time, right, that was the first, but there were many, many more moments like this. And over the 8 years that Alan was the CEO, the company actually turned around. They went from $1 a share to $17 a share, because in his final year, they didn't lose $7 billion. They made $6.6 billion in profit, right? Like, talk about a turnaround. And here's the clincher, I think. When Alan announced his resignation to the board, he gave them a nod for who should succeed him as the CEO. And guess who he picked? He picked Mark Fields, right? Which is really cool. And I wish I could end the story there. But Mark himself only lasted 18 months. And then there's been like a revolving door of CEOs at Ford. I think most of them would probably want Alan back at this point, because what Alan understood is this isn't a one and done thing. You don't build trust. You don't build culture once. You don't go through a great offsite experience and then magically your team is set. You have to stay on it consistently. You have to be watching the behaviors, correcting negative behaviors, building new positive behaviors constantly. And that's what Alan understood more than any of the technical details of turning it around. He understood that I have to be monitoring the culture of this team constantly so this team can figure out how to get itself out of this mess.
Two particular things I want to just jump onto. The first is that the way that we respond as managers is actually like the most important thing in the moment. Like that is the place where the change happens. Because if we respond with negativity, if we respond by shutting something down or blaming someone or negative consequences of any sort, like that immediately undoes any work that we have done up until this point. It just really sets us back. And so like that is just such an important role that we need to play to be able to hear the feedback, hear the criticisms, hear the ideas, whatever it is, and not react negatively, which might, for some of us, be our natural tendency. So we need to like rein ourselves in. The second thing is that I like to say that culture has to be cultivated, not built. Because I think it is a mental model. We build something and then you're kind of done. Like you build a building, well, there's like a little maintenance here and there and stuff like that, but like you built it, so good. But when you cultivate a garden, you can't just like cultivate it one day and then hope your vegetables are all going to show up tomorrow. You have to keep cultivating it and cultivating it and cultivating it. And that is what culture is.
Yeah. Oh, I love that metaphor. I often use, like, I call them the elements of a great team culture, because I think in like chemistry terms, I'm sort of nerdy this way, right? Because every chemical is just a collection of elements. But guess what? If you introduce a new element into it, what happens? It changes, right? So what we want is this structure made up of these three elements, and maybe a few others that don't degrade it. But if there are certain elements you can add in that will destroy it, turn it into a volatile substance, an explosive substance, right? So kind of same deal. You have to constantly monitor it. You're not done right when you build it. And unfortunately, that's where a lot of, in our world, in our industry, that's where a lot of people seek the intervention. They just want the personality test that'll fix it. They just want to go on the offsite. And those are great experiences. But like, if they don't change the habits and norms, then I'm glad you had a good vacation. Sorry you had to go on vacation with your coworkers, but that's what the offsite actually was, right? But if they do, then they can be hugely beneficial, right? Because you're bringing back how we're supposed to behave. You're actually changing the culture there and letting that change stay when you get back to work.
What are some of the first things that we can do if we want to start moving our team culture in the right direction?
It's a great question. It comes down to where you feel like you are behind, right? So in a case like the story of Alan, he felt like immediately of the three elements, and he wouldn't have used this terminology because I hadn't come up with the model yet. But he felt like the psychological safety, that was the thing I needed to focus in on, right? So for others, it might be that sense of building empathy or role clarity or what have you. And for others, it might be that kind of purpose side. So let me do this. Let me give you two, right, for managers, one that would speak to this common understanding and one more on the psych safety side. And maybe if you want to go further, we can talk about, I feel like I'm talking way too long. So maybe we can go for three after I tell you the two. On the psychological safety side, and this actually kind of speaks to the first thing you were saying too, is I want you to really start observing how you behave when people are taking those interpersonal risks. In particular, I have this model now. We use a different acronym in the book, but I've come up with this acronym of make sure that you are real listening, not really listening, because that's too many words, but real as in REAL as an acronym. Make sure that you are actually receiving the information. That's the first R, like you're actually hearing it. You're not staring at your phone. You're not thinking about the 442 unread messages you have in your email inbox. By the way, if you notice, I looked down to get you the actual number of messages in my inbox right now. So that's R. Make sure you're actually receiving it. E is engage. Make sure you're actually engaged. You, by the way, are doing an amazing job of this, because some people are watching your video. You're nodding, you're smiling, right? This is the nonverbal communication. If you can't tell, I talk with my hands. So this is like when I'm into it, I'm like, tell me more. Come on, I want to hear more, right? But whatever you're doing to sort of show you're engaged. Those are table stakes, but A and L are where it really gets potentially difficult, right? The A is align. Make sure you're actually aligned on what they said and what you heard. Check for understanding. This is as simple as saying, okay, it sounds like the gist of the issue is this, or, hey, I feel like at the crux of it is this, or if I understand you right, this is everything you can do to just check for understanding, which shows that you heard them, shows that you received, but also gives you a chance to kind of clarify, right? Because you may have misheard something, you may have been distracted if they were talking for a long period of time, etc., right? And then the L is learn more. I wish I could have just done learn, but it didn't feel right. Learn more, meaning ask some follow-up questions based on what you received and heard and what you checked for alignment on. Where do you need clarification? Where do you need more to the story? If psychological safety is an issue on your team, then I'd be willing to bet this is happening. When people come to you with a problem that they need your help with as a manager, they're not actually coming to you with the real problem. They're coming to you with a version of the problem that they feel safe to tell you. Maybe they're only talking about a symptom and they know the real problem, but they're not sharing it. Maybe they're making it sound like it's less of a big deal than it really is. That's a problem. They're only coming to you with that. And so if you just jump right into advice, you just jump right into, okay, here's how we're going to fix it without taking the time to learn the full story, then you're both frustrated now because you gave them advice they couldn't figure out how to apply because that advice was based on what wasn't the actual situation because they didn't share the actual situation. So now it's a week later and you're like, how come you didn't do this? And like, well, it didn't work. And of course it would work. And well, it's because you didn't take the time to learn more. right? So I think not only is that work on a psych safety standpoint, one-on-one between you and an individual sort of direct report, as people observe you do this, if you notice, this is the Alan Mulally, Mark Fields moment, sharing a vulnerability and making sure that person feels heard, understood. What's your problem? How can I help? So real listening, really actively listening as people come in. So that's first one. And then number two, probably my favorite exercise to do to grow in that sense of empathy with the team is an exercise we call the manual of me. And it's literally writing a user's manual for how you best work, and sharing that out with the team, and then also encouraging them to do the same. I do this around 4 questions. You can add questions to it if you want, but I think you need to hit these core 4, which are all fill in the blanks. The first is I'm at my best when blank, right? So what are my strengths? What are the optimal environments I do my best work? What activities do I really love doing? Number 2, I'm at my worst when. Flip side of that, what bores me to tears? What do I really struggle with, right? The third question is you can count on me to blank, meaning historically, this is where I've helped other teams I've worked on. Boy, how great would it be to know that ahead of time for everybody on your team, right? And then the last question, what I need from you, meaning you as the team, here's where I need support. Here's where I've typically needed help. Believe it or not, as a professional writer, I am a terrible proofreader. What I need from you is a second set of eyes whenever we're working on something really important, and a little bit of grace for the fact that I'll still probably mess up there, and there. Right? Little stuff like that. So that manual of me is a great exercise because it grows that sense of empathy in common understanding on a team. And what I've found with a lot of teams is people end up trading tasks after they do this exercise and share it. In other words, like, oh, you're at your worst when you do this. I love that. Could I do that? Yeah, we could totally change that around. So it even works on the clarity side as well. So I kind of long gave you 2 because I figured which one do you feel like your team may need to grow in? Now you've got both takeaways.
I love these. And I really feel like we should just go for the third that's around the pro-social purpose, because why not?
Okay. All right. I'm going to keep this one really simple because I feel like I'm talking at way too much. When you look at the research on pro-social purpose, no surprise that gratitude is a huge driver of people feeling like they have a sense of pro-social motivation, right? Why? Because if I send you a thank you note, what am I doing? I'm telling you that you did something that helped me. Except that last part is often what people leave out of an expression of gratitude. We're really good at saying thank you so much for blah, 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 blah. We're really bad at often, not everybody, but a lot of us are really bad at adding the here's how it helped me. So that's it. That's literally it. If you as a manager if you're not already making a habit to express gratitude to your people on a regular basis, let's start there. But a lot of people, I assume, if you listen to a show like this, you want to be a great manager. You're probably already doing that anyway. So here's what I encourage you to add. When you write that thank you note, that email, that public praise of somebody in front of the rest of the team, just make sure the last thing you add is an impact statement. Thank you so much for your effort. Here's the impact it had on me, on the team, and the company, and what have you. So you can give somebody that tangible evidence that the work that they're doing matters.
Oh my gosh, beautiful. I love this. Okay, but we have to wrap up. So, David, tell us about a great manager that you worked for and what made this person such a fabulous boss.
Yeah. So, okay, this is going to sound really weird. So I spent about 10 years in business school, and the best in business school, you have a manager called a dean, right? In any academic environment. And the best dean I ever worked for, it was a guy named Marshall. The reason he was a great dean is that he didn't want to do the job. We had a dean, right, who had left very quickly, like basically was interviewing for other positions, didn't tell anyone. And so when they got it, it was a surprise to all of us. And then for a year, we had to have sort of an interim dean while we had time to run a search. So we pulled one of the senior faculty members who, no surprise, was PhD in organizational leadership and all that sort of stuff. And the reason I say he didn't want the job and that's what made him great is that his default response to everything was collaborative. Like he really saw his role as service to the team, meaning if there's something, if there's a decision that needs to be made fast, if there's something I can block them from, I'll do it. But this is also an opportunity to get everybody's input on decisions. So really what happened is we as a department kind of led ourselves for a time, right? And surprise, surprise, when you get a lot of smart people who came from an environment where they're being told what to do, who now get a voice in what they get to do, morale changes, motivation changes, et cetera. And so I'm thinking about, the reason I bring that up is I'm thinking about these listeners and the situation that they're in. Most of them are knowledge workers. Most of them are, hey, you've got a team of really smart people who have gotten past the initial hump of needing to know what to do. And now what they want is to make their voice heard in what we're going to do in the future. Right. So I think there's something everybody can kind of take away from that, but it's not lost on me, right? That the best manager, the best leader I've had in my own career is the one who didn't want the job.
So fun. And the reality is that a lot of people think they want to be a manager, and then they get into the role and they're like, what did I get myself into? And so you might be that person who's like, I don't know if I actually want to be a manager, but it's your job and you're listening to the show because you're like, if I'm going to do this job, I want to do it well. And I appreciate that. So,
Yeah.
all right. And where can people learn more about you, keep up with your work, get copies of your books, all that jazz?
All right. So if you've made it this far, I'm going to assume you like what we're talking about, right? And so the single easiest place to find me is the show notes to this episode, right? Mamie's got all the links. She's got it out there. It's davidburkus.com, and my last name's really weird, so it's easy if you want to type it in. But you can also just like swipe right in your podcast app and see it all. And by the way, while you're there, leave a review, like tap the 5-star, leave some positive comments for her because she's doing an amazing job. But if you go there, you'll find all of my socials. And again, if you don't want to do that, if you're just listening and you can remember, it's davidburkus.com. And please connect with me on this. Like you said, this is a long-term. Cultural change takes time, but it's worth it. And so this is not a conversation that's going away. It's cultivated, right? So as you're cultivating it, if you've got questions, feel free to connect with me and reach out. This is a conversation that is not done when we're done with this podcast.
That's right. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation. And I also appreciate the shout out for the show. So thank you. It's very, very kind.
No, thank you so much for having me.